to give us a peek into this, we have all the authors here, and Benedict to lead the way and talk, bring out how authors, how all of you are influencing climate change and the sustainability discourse. Benedict himself is an editor of Sustainability Next, biographer of C.K. Prahlad, The Mind of the Futurist, and his latest book is Smash, The Rise of Indian Badminton, Stories of Grit and Triumph, that will hit the stand soon. And and I think what I think there's no better person to lead this discussion about sustainability, about climate change than him. So I leave it up to you, Benedict. Now over to you, and looking forward.
Yes, thank you, Pooja. Am I clear?
Yes.
Okay, good. Welcome to three of you. You're my favorite authors, and I have read all your books.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, and I even have a autographed copy of Navi's book, Do Better with Less. And it's pretty huge. So my confession, I couldn't finish all of them, but I've read most of it. Welcome again. Yes, I've had the privilege of reviewing all your books for Sustainability Next. And here's a pitch for Sustainability Next. It is a magazine, online magazine for advocating profit for good in business. So a step beyond doing well by doing good. So a step ahead. So profit for good. So I'm doing this for the last 7 years, and Harini has been an inspiration. She's contributed on and off, and happy to publish a really good article which Megha has sent me in the next issue. So it's clear to me that the three of you are not just writers and teachers. You, to me, are evangelists and missionaries in advocating climate change and sustainability, not as abstract concepts, but how they can be implemented on the ground, how things can change on the ground, which is most important to make it more effective. Yeah, so it's also that through your writings, you try to touch upon the conscience of the readers, conscience of people, and hopefully through them, the policymakers and the bureaucrats and people in the government. So the theme of this session is writing on the wall. So I picked that pretty consciously, writing on the wall, writing on sustainability and climate change. So what is it? What is the writing on the wall that really we need to explain to people? But I'm not stressing that much now. So just another point about my introductory remark, which is that there are several questions that we need to examine, whether how literature and writing on sustainability, climate change, to what extent they have impacted policy, impacted people's behavior. And the general perception is that there's a huge gap between what we write and what has really translated into people's change in behavior and government's policy. And of course, Trump has made it worse for all of us. The second question that I need to leave for discussion is writing on climate change and sustainability has been in the non-fiction space all this while. And I was quite impressed when, rather fascinated by what Amitav Ghosh wrote in his book, The Great Derangement, that to be effective, we need to take sustainability or climate change writing to fiction. And that hasn't happened at all. and he's suggested ways of how to do it, but I leave that question open. How can we move it to fiction, which gets translated into good novels and, of course, good movies? Uh, that's my second broad question. And of course, the third one is uh, social media has really played an effective role in campaigns of people like Greta, but can it? How can it go to the next level? How can it? Uh, how can it have a deeper impact? So these are the three broad questions. I'm sure there are 25 more broad questions that we can come up with. Uh, those are my introductory remarks. So just for the listeners, we have a. I'll just uh, mention about the flow of the session, which is that I would request each of you to introduce yourself. So, which is different from most patterns where we introduce the speakers. But I strongly believe, having seen some examples in other literature fests, that you introduce yourself much better than we do. That's you. You take about a minute each. Then so I would ask each of the panelists. This is for the sake of the listeners, not just who are here now, but also when we put up on YouTube links. What are the great books to read? So we need to, yeah. What are the great books that they can read to not only educate themselves, but to change the way they look at the whole thing? And of course, after that, which is 3 minutes each, and of course, the chunk of the time each of you has is 5 minutes about your work, and each three of you have fascinating work that you've already done. Of course, after that we have a hopefully a vibrant Q&A section. So, okay, so let's start with Navi. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Benedict, first of all, for inviting me to speak at this event. And so very briefly, I was born and raised in Pondicherry in southern India. I left India in 89 before the liberalization happened. And before plastic came, we didn't have plastic bags back then when I was a kid. And then I studied in France for several years, and I've been living in the US for past 20 years now. And my passion always, since my childhood, has been to be a bridge between cultures. So my 3 books that I published actually try to do that. So the first book I published was called Jugaad Innovation. You might have heard about it. Yeah, it sold 200,000 copies in India. And that was my attempt to celebrate the fact that, because I grew up near an urban slum in Pondicherry. So I noticed, as C.K. Prahalad would say, right, marginal, people are not marginal minds, in the sense that I saw the kind of grassroots creativity and ingenuity of poor people. So in a way, Jugaad Innovation was a way of explaining to the West that, we need to learn from these resource constraints environments like India. And this was before climate change, became popular. Yeah. And so that was first book. And then in 2015, I published my book on frugal innovation with my co-authors in the West, to basically make the Western world aware that with growing inequality and climate change, they need to basically learn to do more and better with less. And then finally, last year, I published, as Benedict was saying, this book called Do Better with Less, which was coming full circle back to India, and the fact that India is expected to account for 50% of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We felt that it's important to tell the Indian corporate world and policymakers that India has a historic opportunity, to embark on a sustainable development trajectory that will be good not only for India, but for entire humanity. Yeah. So that's my, career path. I'm not a full-time writer. I'm also a consultant and I'm also, a teacher. But yes, so this has been, my my career so far.
Yeah. So can we go with Harini next?
Sure.
And thank you very much for inviting me. This is a great pleasure to be here. And I think this is a lovely panel. So I'm looking forward to listening to what Megha and Navi have to say. So I am an ecologist and a researcher by sort of training and inclination, I would say. And I've been doing this for close to 30 years, so research in ecology. I am also an educator and a teacher, and I used to work a lot on forests in different parts of India, South Asia. I've also worked in different, forests across the world. About, I'd say 12 years ago, I also started working on cities, partly because I'm from a city, from Bangalore. And so my work on Bangalore, on sustainability issues in Bangalore started very personally, not as an ecologist, not as a researcher, not as a teacher, but happened as a mother of a small child then who was going to grow up in a city that was very different. I was thinking about the childhood she would have growing up in the city, as the daughter of a mother or the niece of several aunts who have wonderful large gardens in Bangalore. And I was building my house, trying to plant plants in my garden, and I found the nurseries didn't carry those kinds of plants anymore because they were saying that they had landscape palms and turf grass, which was very pesticide intensive for the IT sector. And there was a lake near where we were building our house, which was degraded. So I was also a resident of the place, trying to figure out why lakes were being degraded. There were roads where I grew up in Bangalore, in South Bangalore, very majestic trees, and those trees were being cut in the hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands, in fact, for road widening projects. And these were 100-year-old trees, 80-year-old trees, magnificent trees, right? So here I was seeing the city change before my eyes, and I started thinking of two things. One is that, why am I studying distant forests? Not that they're not important, I still study them. But why is nobody studying this city? Because it sort of falls between the cracks. Ecologists like to study distant forests, and of course, because they're beautiful to study. And people who study the city pretend or think of it as though nature doesn't exist in the city, and you don't need nature to survive in the city. Just the distant forest will do. So I started studying Bangalore more as a practitioner or a parent or a resident, and now it's expanded to be maybe 80% of my research focus. So I have two books. I wrote Nature in the City, which is an ecological history of Bangalore in 2016, which is a broad sweep, 1,500-year history of Bangalore. Essentially, what I'm trying to get at, whether in my forest work or my cities work, is we always say people are responsible for bad things, right? Climate change, environmental degradation. But people are also very positive agents of change. When people get together as communities, as collectives, they can be extremely important agents of change. Yeah. And so what are the conditions that create that? It's leadership and it's innovation, as Navi was saying, but it's also something that there are conditions under which people can come together. And so I'm very interested in understanding what those conditions are. One of the things I've realized over time is imagination is a big part of that. So which is why I've taken to writing in a big way. And Cities and Canopies, therefore, is my second book in 2019, co-authored with a friend and colleague. And that book is taking trees out to the wider public, in a very
you can explain that
way. How do you
can explain that in the next one.
How do you touch trees? How do you make art with trees? What kinds of poems and riddles can you talk about trees? And then where's the science? Where's the ecology? Where's the evolution? What is the animal behavior around trees? What's the environmental impact of not having trees versus having trees? So I'll stop with this. This is broadly me, but this is the sort of the personal motivation that brought me to do these kinds of things, to reach out, I think. And increasingly, I'm feeling that scientists, I've been on IPCC reports as co-authors. I think we just need to do a far better job of reaching out to the public than we've been doing so far.
Yeah. Excellent, Harini. So over to Megha.
Okay. So I have a somewhat unconventional background in that I've been working in Indian children's publishing for about 10 plus years now. And I work with children because adults tend to baffle me. I prefer the company of children quite often. Sorry, I'm saying this completely.
That's fine.
But and my introduction to environmentalism was serendipitous. I mean, it just happened. I started out with as an editor on the nature team at Penguin India, and I started editing these books on a trot, on birds and insects and mammals, and it was a world that I hadn't really, my mother's an avid gardener, so yeah, sure. I mean, I love the flower as much as the next person, but editing those books. And then a couple of years later, I was commissioned to actually put together this handbook on courses and careers in the environmental field for students in India. And that's when I actually started writing on my own. And that was more of a challenge, because now I was not just editing other people's works, but I was also writing my own. And that was suddenly open to somebody else's editing. And then I had to, I was reading a lot more about, Indian scholarship on environmentalism and Indian writing. And can you hear me? Sort of, yeah.
Yeah, we can.
So, that really set me up. And 2013 was the year I was commissioned to write that book. And after that, it's just been, a series of more writing, more interactions, more reading. It's really been the best form of education. It's been driven entirely by interest. So that was the first book that I was commissioned to write in 2013 by Terry. Nothing very literary. It's not bedtime reading at all. And then this was a picture book that I wrote. So as you can see, a lot of my writing is also for children. Yes. And the book for which I am here, which just came out, was this one. It's the big non-fiction book. And it's my big sort of foray into actually testing the waters as a writer in this field. And it's been interesting. I mean, I like my audience. I like children's. I like the company of children. But I also find that a lot of adults enjoy children's books. And it's just been a fascinating sort of experience with readers, with the way we all relate to the environment, with my own sort of relationship with the environment, and how it's there in the background, but it's all pretty much there in my life too. So it's been a great couple of years of self-discovery and otherwise.
So I love reviewing Megha's book Unearthed. I found that it's such a nice summary of summary of several critical environmental events that happened in India in the last 30 years, and educative. And I even wrote in the review that it should be made into a textbook for all high school children, because it not just the history of environmental history, but it also I was quite surprised how the the publishers allowed it. It has a lot of political angle to it as well, and activist angle to it as well. But it was really fascinating reviewing your book, Megha.
Thank you so much, Benedict. I also forgot to say the customary thanks. I'm really thankful for this opportunity, and really looking forward to this conversation with Harini and Navi and you, Benedict. And I must actually thank you. That was the first review of my book. So it was the first sort of litmus test. So thank you very much.
Great. So I'd request each of you to spend 2-3 minutes on what are the really great books that you have read and inspired you in this area. This is, as I said, the purpose of this is to let others know what they should read, what they should be exposed to. Now we will start with you.
Sure. So I will try to be, brief. And so essentially, I would, because you're limited time, let me focus on the business books and the books that actually try to connect, profitability and sustainability, because in the West, that's very difficult to reconcile them. There are two people that are right now quite popular. Kate Raworth, I think I mispronounced her name maybe, but she's based in the UK. And she has popularized and written about this concept of the donut economics, which is quite popular now in Europe. And this is essentially the notion that policymakers can contribute to economic growth, drive economic growth, but within the planetary boundaries. So the idea is to reconcile macroeconomic growth with sustainability. John Elkington is also British. He's the famous person who coined the term triple bottom line, showing to companies that, if they take care of the planet and people, profit will follow. And his latest book is called The Green Swans, like the black swans. The Green Swans is about this idea of regenerative capitalism. It's a new vision for capitalism, that he has written about. And then in India, interestingly, my favorite author is Devdutt Patnaik.
Wow.
And the reason I like him is because it's also connected to my next book, which is called Conscious Society, where I'm trying to bring, the spiritual dimension to sustainability, in the sense that, in India, where this concept of Purusha Prakriti, right? So, which is masculine, feminine, and generally Prakriti is nature. And we tend to, for a long time, right, in spiritual traditions, we kind of focus too much on the Purusha part, which is this Brahman and the transcendental, kind of reality. But I think nature is reminding us that, Prithvi, right, Earth, we have to pay attention to Prithvi also, because we live here, right? So, and he has actually been, in my opinion, the one author in India, right, that actually has tried to create a synthesis between Purusha and Prakriti. Like, for example, in his book on Sita, right, when he shows, Ram, Sita, and Lakshman going to the jungle as part of their exile, we might think as citizens, city dwellers, like, wow, there must have been suffering there, in the jungle. But it actually shows how, in the jungle, actually, they were very happy. They were provided for all their needs. And so, in other words, it showed how the jungle is very generous. And I think Arini knows probably Susan Simard, was actually a forest biologist in Canada. And she actually done a famous TED Talk explaining what we can learn from nature, right? So I think Devdutt Patnaik is, my opinion, without maybe even knowing it himself, is, I think, one of the foremost proponent of bringing together Purusha and Prakriti, because we need to look at nature with this kind of, as a sacred, right? The same way we go to temple to pray, these idols, I think every tree has to be worshipped as well. And I think we have the tradition in India for millennia. We just lost touch with it. So I like his books.
Excellent. Thanks a lot. Hi, Harini?
Yeah. So the lovely books I'm going to, of course, I know some of them, but I'm going to go look the others up. The ones I would point to, well, an old childhood favorite, we don't talk about it much anymore, but is Shivram Karant's Mukherjee Kanasugalu, which is a Kannada book. Translated into English, it becomes Mukherjee's Dreams. And Mukherjee is an ajji or a grandmother who can't speak, or rather, people think she can't speak. But she's essentially decided to stop speaking because she feels like people around her have nothing much to say, and she's bored of inane chatter. But she speaks to her grandson. So these are conversations she has with her grandson under what we call an Ashwatthakatta. These lovely large sacred trees that you will see on a platform somewhere in the middle of nowhere in a crowded city or in a rural area where people sit. So she has one of these kattes of platforms under her house, and she sits and talks to her grandson, and she dreams at night. She has these wonderful mystic dreams about evolution of man and the meaning of humanity, and she shares them with her grandson in this lovely atmosphere below this ficus tree, below the people tree. So that is a lovely book. It made a lot of impression on me as a college-going kid. I found it's also where I got it. I bought it under a ficus tree in Jayanagar bus stop for 10 rupees on the roadside. It's one of those typical Indian finds that you treasure all your life. What am I reading now? Robert Macfarlane, a beautiful writer in the UK whose power of words moves you. And essentially, the one book I tried to recommend, all his books really, but the one book is The Lost Words, where he talks about a lot of English words that are fading away, which are linked to nature, which we lose from the dictionary in a few years because they relate to places or birds or aspects of nature that are fading from our lives. So to me, that is just a beautiful way of thinking. And there are so many lost words in Indian languages that we simply haven't thought of. So I think that's something we should do. And there I'm connecting to your idea, Navi, of spirituality or an emotional connect. Language is a way of bringing that connect. And the third is a US writer called Barbara Kingsolver, and I don't know if you've read about her most famous book is the Poisonwood Bible, but which is about an African missionary family. But the one that I really like is called Prodigal Summer, which is it's just a beautiful book. It's about 3 very different people and one summer where they meet, but one of them is a park ranger, and you just get a sense of how local, everyday people in small town America, very urbanized settings, but yet nature is so much a part of their life and shapes them in every way and everything that they do. So these are sort of the books that To me also fiction, like you, Benedict, I think fiction is a great way to connect to people who might not otherwise think of nature, right?
Yeah.
So I'm always interested in how that works.
Great. So maybe you can try it next.
Yeah.
Megha, over to you.
No, actually, a lot of the books that I've enjoyed are not surprisingly children's books. And I've been reading a lot of children's books. And the books I thought of talking of today are all Indian children. There's this book by Siddharth Sarma, he's Assamese, called Year of the Weeds, which I think is a wonderful book for anyone who wants to really understand people's movements in India. All sorts of, it's told from the perspective of a little boy, Korok, who loves to garden. And, he's a gardener. But so many different, and then Benedict, when you spoke of fiction, it just came to my mind what fiction can do, because it's based on a very real incident. It's based on the uprising in Niyamgiri, but it's just so relatable. People come alive in fiction, in storytelling. So that's one book I always recommend to anyone who wants to understand people's movements in India. And then there's a lovely book by Tara called Water, which is such a fascinating book, in terms of understanding what water means to us. It's again told from the perspective of a Gond tribal who moves from the village to the city, and how his relationship with water is very different in the village and very different in the city. And I think that's a very great way of understanding, our relationship with water, which is an increasingly scarce resource. I remember a couple of years back, I had this very interesting conversation with Ramchandra Guha, where he told me, that one of his favorite bits of writing is actually a children's poem, The Elephant and the Tragopan, by Vikram Seth. It's from Vikram Seth's book, Beastly Tales from Here and There. And he said, what a wonderful way of introducing anyone to the idea of dams. And it's so true. I think you can listen to the poem on YouTube. It's part of this anthology, but that was the particular poem that he cited. The good thing about children's literature, I feel, is that it just makes the subject of environmentalism so accessible. Because I remember when I started writing, when I started editing books, of course, these were books that were written for lay readers. But gradually, as I started reading more, I remember the books that really appealed to me were ones that really came down to me and appealed to me in the sense that I could relate to them at a very personal level. I could relate to the characters in those books. I could relate to the stories being told in that book. In fact, I must say, Harini, when you spoke Citizen Canopies, I remember browsing through the book, and what I really liked is, for a long time, I thought that books on environment sometimes got really heavy. I absolutely, one of the first books I picked up and which I liked too was P. Sainath's Everybody Loves a Good Drought, which was interesting, and as was Ramchandra Kumar and Madhav Gadgil's This Fissured Land. And they're great reads, but they are sometimes they can get a little inaccessible for the lay reader. But I remember when I picked up Harini's book, and it was fascinating because I bought it back for my mum. It's such a great way of introducing lay readers to the idea of a tree. We don't look at it. So that's what I'm always looking for as a writer, as a publisher, as an editor. I always enjoy books that make environmentalism come alive for me, And one of the shortcomings of my reading list is it doesn't have too many international names. So I've jotted down very diligently all the names that Navi and Harini have. I've read some of them, of course, but I have jotted them down diligently to pick them up the next time.
Just to say, I read The Year of the Weeds a few months back in March, and I was blown away by it. So it's just, one of the best books that I've read recently.
Yes, such a nice book. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I think I know which books to pick up for review. Especially Green Swan is amazing. The way and the title itself is really captivating. I think Harini has to leave early, so I'll ask her my first question, which is that she teaches sustainability at Azim Premji University, just take us through the experience of teaching sustainability to students in 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So how was the experience?
So I find teaching the most moving of experiences and the most educative of experiences, in fact. So I've always learned so much from my students. What is it, if I think back? So we do at the university a course for masters in development students. And it's a core course, which means they have to take it in their first semester when they join, and it's called Ecology and Development, and it's tracing the link between ecology and development issues. Yeah. And actually, no other university in the world makes you do a compulsory course on ecology for students of development.
Yeah, excellent.
They come in kicking and screaming, and they used to come in kicking and screaming. I left biology in my 10th standard. Why do you make me do this? And it's not biology heavy.
Yeah.
But then they go into the field and they say, 2-3 years later, oh my God, all the things that you told us, it makes so much sense now. So there's 4 of us who teach 4 different batches, because we do this in relatively small groups of 50 students. But what I'm finding over time is, over 7 or 8 years of teaching sustainability to students, the ones who 7-8 years ago thought that it was not for them and needed to go to the field to understand why it was for them, that has gone away. You find young people that come in now know the dangers of climate change. They see floods, they see droughts, they see the pandemic. They understand that these are systemic issues. At one level, that's wonderful. At another level, it's very sad, because look at the space of change that's compressing that. Young people who come in now, they know that they're not going to have the kind of life that their parents had, or even older siblings, let's say 7-8 years older than them, had. They're going to be entering a very different world, and naturally they are fearful. So the other challenge that we always have is that teaching sustainability is one of those what we call classic dismal disciplines.
Yeah.
You teach about something, at the end of 6 months, you have young people looking steadily more and more hopeless. So we're always searching for positive case studies, and there are a lot.
Okay.
Positive, which are not superficial, feel good, but really delve into the, it's been hard for all the people who made a difference. They've made mistakes, they've learned, they've struggled, they've persisted. And I, like Megha, strongly believe in the power of collectives. I also believe in the power of the individual and creativity, but you need the collective, as we all know, to move beyond that and to get it into change.
Yeah.
So I think those kinds, that's really where our struggle is with sustainability. How do you tell them that this is a systemic issue? You can't have a silver bullet fix. But on the other hand, it's not hopeless, and we have to all get in there. So
they have pressure of jobs, because they study to get a job later. Will they get a job doing the course there?
They actually, so we don't have any dearth of this. Our placements are very good. 95% of them get jobs. I think the market for sustainability/development is very strong. Everybody knows that they need it. I tell you what, there's not a job for. There's not a job for super specialized. If you train them in, let's say, green lawns or better agriculture or water or solar, then the job. But you train them in a more broad-based way where they can adapt and move from place to place, then there's a lot of scope. So we've actually moved away from specialized training in sustainability.
Yeah, excellent. So Navi, over to you. I glanced through the piece that you sent. I quite like the title of that, which is Soul to Soul, which is SOLE, Soul to SOUL. So take us through that.
Yeah, sure. Essentially, my next book is on consciousness. I use the chakras, right, the system, to show that essentially there are 4 stages in the evolution of consciousness. So in a way, I refer to Sri Aurobindo's, research on integral consciousness, right? So my generation X, essentially, which runs most companies today, we are, driven by sense of guilt. We screwed up basically massively by polluting. And so we are focused on reducing our carbon footprint, right? So all the kind of announcements you hear right now is like, reducing our emissions by, 50%, become carbon neutral by 2030. That's what Gen X is focused on right now. And that's my generation. The next one, the millennials, are known for being more activist, more action-oriented. So they want to go beyond sustainability. And now we are talking about this concept of regeneration, which is about consciously having a positive impact on planet and society by enlarging your handprint, which is, ecological handprint. So this is about going from reducing footprint to widening your handprint.
Yeah.
And then if you go back up in the chakra system, then you have the heart chakra, right? The anahata. So when that gets opened up, you see the Gen Z, the younger ones, who are actually trying to feel nature, right? Because nature is not something out there, we should either preserve or regenerate. We are part of the biosphere. So they are trying to connect with nature in a more symbiotic way and emotional level. So that's the heart print. So the Gen Z is focused more on widening their heart print, leaving a bigger heart print. And then finally, the generation Alpha, which is Greta Thunberg, right? They are the first children of the 21st century. They are actually moving up in the chakra system and going beyond the third eye and even maybe the Sahasrara, the seventh chakra, which is really about non-duality and the sense of unity with the cosmos. So their effort is going to be to leave a larger soul print, right? Because they actually want to connect with the throat chakra, which is about self-expression. And this is where I think, as Harini was saying, that that's going to be the first generation, and that's my focus in my next book, which is going to do the best of two things that the Western and Eastern culture are known for, which is they're going to be authentic and express their true potential, which is the throat chakra, but do that at the service of others, right? The collective. So it's going to be basically this reconciliation of individuality, the fullest expression of individuality, in harmony with collective purpose, right? So that's the soul print. And that's what I see actually. My niece is 16 years old, and she goes to a philosophy class in France. She said, I don't understand how my philosophy professor said that humans are here to control and dominate nature. It doesn't compute for me in a very instinctive way. So that means that the consciousness, right, not even mentally, they just feel that visceral osmosis, with nature. And that's why I call it soul print, because it's not, any more distinction between saving humanity and saving nature. We are part of, one integrated symbiotic ecosystem. So that's how I see the evolution of, sustainability.
Really fascinating. I request the audience, if they have questions for Harini to pose, maybe she can take one or two before she leaves. While the questions come, can I ask Megha to speak about her fascination with children? And you did write an article recently about children literature and sustainability and climate change. Quickly, can you take us through that?
The thing about I don't have children, so it baffles my parents why children's literature. But I just I think they are really quirky and amusing, and although I must correct the notion, if anybody thinks they are little saints, they are wildly misguided. That's not true. Children are not little saints. No. There's a lot to. There's a lot of honesty there, I think, and there is a lot of potential. I just feel that I think when we talk, like we are increasingly in this world, when we talk of sustainability and we talk of concepts, we talk of thinking long term. And I always think that any plan that is long term thinking needs to have children and needs to have the environment, squarely in the center of, right at the center of it, because that's when you really sort of indicate to me that you're not thinking of now, but you're thinking of 10 years or 20 years hence. So that is one thing. That is one reason why I'm, I really believe in thinking about children, and I am so interested in children. The other thing also is, I think increasingly I do find in my interactions with kids, because I've gone to schools and I've done some work with WWF, where we went to colleges and schools and spoke to kids, is that, as Navi was just talking, that this is a generation that wants to express itself. There is a very strong intention to make your thoughts public. But when they make their, thoughts public, sometimes I feel that, I'm not sure of the place where those thoughts are coming from. Like, I feel that there is some need to give more context to what is driving this generation.
Mm-hmm.
For example, it's quite interesting, Navi, you spoke of Greta Thunberg. And I did actually write a short piece on the Greta generation, about how it's inspiring climate strikes all over the world by young people. But I was talking to some of these kids, in India, there are a couple of kids, Lichipriya and Ridhima Pandey and all, who've done some work in this field. And I asked them about their experiences. And what Ridhima told me quite candidly, as only a child can. First, she spoke about talking to Greta, and she said, she doesn't, she's very nice, but she doesn't talk much, and you can't hug her. She has a problem with hugs.
Okay.
And so then I asked her, so what is it about Greta that you really liked? And she said, she doesn't just talk about it. She actually does pretty hard stuff. Like, she doesn't eat any non-vegetarian food, and she stopped taking flights. So I was, that was just, it's one of those things about children that I don't think adults are capable of. We just like to make everything sound very fancy sometimes. The other thing, though, she was telling me, she just organized her first climate strike, and I asked her, and she actually told me that there are many people who want to be part of this because they think it's fashionable to talk about the environment, that, they'll get more points, more brownie points if they suddenly turn environmentalist, So one really needs to probe intention when it comes to young people. And that's something I really enjoy. I love talking to them to really get to where is it that they're coming from. And in that, I've really learned a little bit about what is driving them. Sometimes it starts from a very superficial level where they just want to, impress everyone with their green quotient. But as they, read and if they're sort of bought in the company of people, and I think the people power really comes in here. They bought in the company of people who can inspire them, with their work, and talk to them. And I've sort of noticed, if they are sufficiently inspired and motivated, then that sort of superficial level changes to a more, as Navi and Harini were talking of earlier, more personal, more conscious sense of environmentalism and really feeling nature. And this especially is true of the urban kids, the kids in city schools especially. Interestingly, when I've gone to schools in slightly rural areas in India where children are actually coming face to face with environmental hardships, it's a very different world to operate in. Sometimes initially my concern there was that I began to feel a little out of depth, because I am a city kid like Harini. I have grown up in cities. I was born in Delhi. I have spent a long time of my life. My father had a transferable job, but it was somehow always to cities. So we were in Delhi. We went to Mumbai for a while. Then I was in Chennai. We lived in Perth for a while. We were in Singapore for a while. Then now we're back in Delhi. So my experiences have been very urban. But, a child who stays in a place where water is really scarce. And, for example, I remember this whole conversation with a child who said, why do people say India has so many seasons? It has just 2 seasons. It's hot and then it's wet. So you talk to them, you really understand how is a child, how is that sort of very formative relationship with nature, how is that building? And what are some of the things that fascinate children about the environment? And the interesting thing about developing children's books on environment is that they come from a place where you really need to know your reader, because you're betting on books for them.
So, are they only in English, or are they also in Indian languages?
Sorry?
Your books?
Yeah. So the thing is, I work with Tulika. I work with Tulika Publishers. I've been working with Tulika for the last 7 years. This is my 8th year with them. And the really great thing about Tulika's catalog is that our picture books are translated in 8 Indian languages, apart from English. So I remember this book that we just came out with called Can You? It was published in, I think, 2018. And such a wonderful way of introducing children to the concept of biodiversity. Mm-hmm. So it has these little questions that says, can you taste with your toes? And the answer is that if you are a butterfly, you can, because butterflies have these taste sensors on their legs. And then can you bathe with your nose? And if you're an elephant, you can. So it's quite humorous. It sounds very simple, but I think in doing all of this, it just gives you these very fundamental realizations about our relationship with nature and how the early years really matter in developing that basic respect and consciousness for the natural environment.
Yeah, thanks, Megha. Thanks. I really love the way you enjoy what you do. Yeah. So I think there's a question for Harini, and Harini, you can answer this and leave, which is you also work with corporates. Do you see, of course, there is an incremental improvement in the way they deal with sustainability and sustainability reports and things like that. But how much of a gap you think there is between what they can really do and what they're really doing now?
The gap is unfortunately huge. Fortunately, it seems to be getting better because you see at least a number of international companies signing on to this commitment to be carbon neutral, water neutral by 2030. Now we have to see what that actually brings in. I'm often a little. I wonder where this goes.
It's a PR exercise.
Yeah, I think so. But on the other hand, so I'm thinking about it and I don't have an answer to this. A lot of it is greenwashing, and we know that a lot of it is greenwashing. But on the other hand, unless you get the big corporates into actually cutting down on, let's say, plastic waste or making their packaging recyclable, those kinds of things, unless you get them to commit, you're not going to really have meaningful progress towards sustainability. Now, I think, but for that, you have to have a mix. I think the problem is we are expecting right now them to do this out of the goodness of their own heart. But if the bottom line is profit, they're not going to, right?
Yeah.
But they get measured on. Where are the government policies that come in that give them, for instance, some kind of a subsidy or an encouragement or a nudge? Where's the carrot and where is the stick really from the government side? I don't see that coming. And especially if you're international, multinational agencies, then you can just hop over from country to country. So the country who's just first implementing this is not, nobody wants to be first because they'll lose business. So I think there's a lot which is systemic, which we simply haven't dealt with. But I also think that that's why I'm saying I'm in two minds about it. There is greenwashing, a lot of it. But I think we need to figure out somewhere how to make this progress. And there are some good players who are trying to make real changes. So I think we need to see how can we change the moral structure of the incentive so that everybody at least wants to show that they're doing better. Maybe that's one way to.
Yeah, I'm tempted to add to this question, which is that while SEBI makes it mandatory for financial reporting, whereas they say that only top 100 companies or top 500 companies can do sustainability reporting.
Yeah.
So what stops them from saying all companies with, say, more than 10 crore turnover should do a sustainability report?
Absolutely. Or putting even some structure. Some of these sustainability reports say nothing, if you look at them. So there is no structure to what all you have to report within the sustainability report also. So there's absolutely a lot of place for regulation to play a role and make a systemic change because they're not going to do it on their own.
Yeah. So great. I think we had a fascinating session today. I just want to end with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. I think if anyone needs a good quote, you always go to Mahatma Gandhi to see which is the best quote you could pick. So this is about the writing on the wall, going back to our theme, where he says that writing on the wall, it's also a warning. It is a warning that if nobody reads the writing on the wall, man will be reduced to the state of the beast, whom he is shaming by his manners. Yeah, this is the one. So on this note, I would like to thank all of you for taking time and really amazing session. I think we learned a lot. I learned a lot, and we'll keep the conversation going through the magazine, through Sustainability Next, that is. Thank you very much.